Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Chapter 4. A Bird in the Hand. Just how fucked did this manage to get, and how did it manage to get this fucked? The general growled as his cigar smoldered angrily between his clenched fingers. The cabal of string pullers and commanders were rank in their clothes, all but the black-suited stranger at least, who had changed into a fresh, identical suit which had been produced by one of his silent retinue who waited in a windowless room down the outer corridor. The suited man sighed and looked over his shoulder. "Gordon?" The voice from the shadows spoke next. "We're not entirely cooked. Clearly he got his communication systems knocked out, but his locator beacon is still working. And we did get the fight we wanted. Sort of. We were supposed to bring him to heel by giving him an enemy. Now he's gone flying off with a damn near $1 billion piece of military hardware with an asshole inside of it. God knows what he'll do," the general bellowed in between moody puffs on his stogie. "I'm sure he's not doing anything too depraved to him," the admiral to the general's left said. "To who?" replied the general. "To Stillwell," the admiral clarified. "I don't give a fuck about that goddamn stooge. I want the fucking hardware back." "Gentlemen," Gordon said, concealed within the shadows, "I think perhaps we're missing the silver lining here. His locator is still on and functioning, which means we know where he is, which means we know where Supreme is." "Good. Well, let's nuke the goddamn freak and be done with it already," the general insisted. "That's really your solution to everything, isn't it, Arnold?" the admiral said dryly. "Go fuck yourself, Frank." "Fellas, I'm actually with the talking patch of darkness over there," the nameless CIA officer said, twirling a bit of his beard between his fingers. "Maybe we can use this. We know where he is, and it's likely his lair or headquarters or whatever. Looks like a dump on the satellite," the admiral chimed in. "It is a dump. It used to be a warehouse for a logging company. But at any rate, we know where he stays. That's better than nothing," finished CIA guy. "What about Stillwell, though? Why did he bring him there?" the man in the pristine suit inquired. "If I had to guess, I think maybe they're buddies. The way they were hurling those cars at one another, it looked more like a game than a fight, don't you think?" The CIA officer turned to the large screen along the wall, and with a tap on the touchscreen before him, played the evening news footage of the battle upon the Brooklyn Bridge. "Watch. They take turns, and then as soon as he zaps him, look, he looks like he didn't mean to hurt him. Then he picks him up and flies away." He tapped again on the screen, and it went dark. "If Stillwell is with him and they're gonna be buddy-buddy, all we need is to reestablish comms, and we might be able to bring him into the fold even easier than we thought." "So it all relies on Stillwell?" the general asked, his face contorting with discomfort over the idea. "And for now, yes," CIA replied. "Well, fuck. Is your shoulder okay?" Supreme asked as Mark climbed back to his feet, waving his arm about in a vain attempt to stretch. It wasn't until a bit of metal groaned and Mark toppled over that Supreme realized he probably shouldn't have tried to pull the arm off in the first place. "Yeah, I'll be okay. Falling down in this thing sucks. There's like padding, but it doesn't stop you from feeling all the weight," he replied. "Sorry." "No worries. So, how'd you find this place?" Mark asked, looking again at the building as the two entered through the large bay door. I just sort of flew around until I found somewhere that would work. Somewhere that no one would find me. I think it works, Supreme said, almost proudly, as the dust kicked up from their entrance floated in the air. Nice TV, Mark commented, looking at the gargantuan flat screen which sat out in the middle of the floor before the makeshift living room. Thanks, it's great for watching Pat's games. Want a beer or something? Mark sighed. I would love one, but... He trailed off, gesturing to his helmet. Oh, right. Shit. Supreme thought a moment as he glanced about, before his eyes came to rest on his bong. It was a tall, bright yellow glass piece, with various dots of color along the neck and base. Hey, I got an idea. You got like an air intake on there somewhere? Yeah, sure, I've gotta have one somewhere, Mark replied, feeling about on the helmet and neck of the suit. His finger brushed along something that felt very much like a vent, pointing it out to Supreme. Here, shotgun, Supreme said, taking a hefty pull from the large glass pipe. Stepping closer to Mark, he forcefully blew the cloud of smoke in through what they had rightfully assumed to be the intake vent. You getting anything? He asked, between light coughs. Mark sniffed the air inside the helmet. Nothing yet, but... Oh, wait, there we go, he said, as smoke began filling the helmet. Taking a deep breath, Mark felt glad at least to enjoy some modicum of reprieve from his otherwise eventful evening. Yet, just as he exhaled and felt the fuzziness of the high begin to take effect, red warning lights and alarms filled the helmet as the suit's air hazard system kicked in. He simply couldn't win, and now more than ever, he knew it. After a few moments, the alarms went silent and the lights went out. It had given Mark a slight headache, though he was relatively certain it was there before. Regardless, between the exhaustion from the night's events and the apparent potency of Supreme's weed, he soon felt quite stoned, and for the first time in recent memory, quite relaxed. So, let me ask you, Mark began as the two lounged in the living room space of the large open warehouse. Supreme in his easy chair, Mark laid out on the sofa. What's the deal with all that Nazi stuff? Supreme rolled his eyes. I didn't know they were Nazis. I thought they were just fans. They seemed all, I don't know, patriotic and shit. Yeah, it's kind of their thing. Blood and soil and all that bullshit. But yeah, you need to watch out who you make friends with on the internet. This one time, I got to be buddies with this guy playing this crazy online fantasy game. And a few months later, come to find out he chopped up his mom and stuck her into a freezer chest for interrupting his game. Fucked up, right? Damn, Supreme said, his eyes glazed over. He was damn good at that game, though, said Mark, absent-mindedly taking a drink from his recycled piss hose. Well, it's just... I don't get it. I don't get how I can win. I try to be a good guy, a hero, and I end up with half the world thinking I'm some kind of a Nazi and the other half thinking I'm some kind of... The Supreme made a sarcastic face and drew up a pair of air quotes so as to highlight how stupid even he could find such a notion. Anti-white commie or something. Shit. Sounds like you've been reading YouTube comments. You should never read comments. Everyone knows that, Mark said, nodding with his helmet, though the action failed to translate outwardly. Well, some of them can be nice. Mark smirked. Really? He asked dryly. Supreme pulled out his phone and began scrolling. See? Here's one. He cleared his throat. I knew I could trust in this guy as soon as I saw his choice in clothing. See, that's kind of nice, right? I don't know how to tell you this, but that Supreme getup of yours, it's kind of what? Mark searched for the right words, not wishing to be too mean to his new friend. Well, it's kinda douche. It's like the go-to douchebag's uniform, or at least it used to be. It's a nice hoodie, Supreme replied, feeling subtly defensive about his broader brand and decisions. I'm sure it is, but is it really worth $200 or whatever? Well, no, but Supreme felt slightly defeated. Hey, don't worry about it. Fuck those people, right? Also, it's your brand. You're kinda married to it now. Might as well lean into it, Mark offered, sensing Supreme's disappointment. He wished in that very moment that he could have a stiff drink. There was one sitting mere feet from him on the coffee table, which seemed to double as a bar for the time being, as Supreme threw one shot after another back, seemingly to little effect. However, he could not imbibe anything that was not already in his suit, short of apparently bong hits, which caused alarm bells to ring and his head to do the same along with them. He found it sadly ironic that he'd accepted this job to get out of prison, only to be more closely confined and teased with the freedom of the world than he was in Rikers. Reflecting on his overall decisions, as one is like to do when stoned and depressed, he shrugged within the metal frame, feeling nothing if not consistent in his choices. So, what do you think I should do? Supreme asked as he poured yet another shot. I don't know. You mean like the media and stuff? Yeah, Supreme replied, throwing the liquor back casually. I mean, there's gotta be something I can do, right? Mark thought on this for a moment. Well, you could go on the offensive. With the media? Yeah, get a little proactive with it, you know? So I should beat up a news anchor? Supreme said before instantly realizing how wrong he was. No, I mean like a charm offensive. Go do an interview or something. Or, I don't know, maybe try a podcast, Mark suggested, as a brief and passing moment of claustrophobia came and went. Like, start one? Maybe. But it'd probably be better to just find one to go on. Like a big famous one. Not a bad idea. What about TV news? Cable or whatever? Supreme was liking this idea more and more. I guess, but that's kind of boomer shit, don't you think? Plus, you know you can never trust those people. They're just gonna play it up hoping for some soundbite to make you look like an asshole. Supreme nodded. Yeah, you're probably right. Hey, do you think I'm an asshole? Nah, not really. No more so than anybody else, Mark said, shrugging. To him, everyone was an asshole to a certain degree, himself naturally included. Well, thanks, I guess, replied Supreme, only slightly insulted. You're very welcome. So, how would I go about getting on a podcast then? I bet you can email them. Just tell them, hey, I'm the superhero guy and I want to come on your podcast. I'd be idiots not to book you. Alright, yeah, good idea. Who should I reach out to, do you think? Mark paused, thinking over it for a moment. There's Hogan. Hogan? As in Josh Hogan? Yeah, he's pretty much the biggest podcaster out there. I bet he'd like to talk to you. Supreme pulled up a video of the podcast, cleverly named the Bro Hogan Sideshow, on his phone, and skipped some 10 minutes in to get past the ads. It was a standard affair. Hogan, the host, sat smoking a cigar as he chatted with a guest who sat opposite him. In this particular episode, the guest was a researcher of some kind, and the two were discussing a history of breakfast cereals. You see, began the guest, take any popular breakfast cereal out there, Fruity Pebbles, for example. With Fruity Pebbles, we get it very obvious. I mean, it's plainly obvious, and anyone who tells you they can't see is a damn liar. But with Fruity Pebbles, we get an obvious nod and homage to our hunter-gatherer ancestors.
It's plain as day, and research into the Paleolithic dietary habits shows that they were the ones who learned and passed down the discovery that, yes, breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Wow, replied Hogan. That is wild.
Indeed. Consider Cheerios. What's the main word there? Cheer. As in you feel cheer when you eat cereal. Now you'll notice these are largely all the work of Kellogg's and the original Dr. Kellogg. He had a lot of ideas. A lot of ideas that would get him cancelled today. And that right there is why those who are looking to subvert our dietary habits, I call them brunch people, they're always the ones trying to shut down discussion about this,
the guest said. That is wild. Why do you think the brunch people have it in for you like that? Hogan asked.
Well, it's because they can't make up their damn minds. Do you want breakfast or do you want lunch? Because they're two very different things. Very different things. And to try combining them like that is to bring additional chaos into a system that relies on order. This is why those goddamn brunchists, it's also what I call them, brunchists, that's why they're so hostile to tradition. Their blood sugar stays low until they go out for their brunch, which again is technically breakfast, as the root words there are breaking and fast. So technically, they could hold off on eating until sundown, and that supper would still be breakfasts. And they just hate having to admit that to the world of breakfast cereals, this fancy culinary Marxism. You need to, well, eat your damn cornflakes. That's how you grow up and mature to be a big boy.
Wow, that is wild, Hogan replied. Do you think that's true? Supreme asked Mark, who was still lounging on the couch. Is what true? All that stuff he said about breakfast cereal. Do you think that's all true? Mark thought the theory over for a second, before dismissing it with a shrug. It wasn't that he had a definite opinion of it either way, but the notion of even a bowl of cereal was enough to inspire mild hunger pains. Pains he knew would only get worse. Pains he knew he could only answer with more recycled waste material. Oh, the glamorous life of supersuits. Maybe. Who knows? He said, sitting up in his seat. Gonna email them? Yeah, sure. Well, maybe this will help me sort of clear my name. Well, we can call it Nazi, or, what's the opposite of a Nazi? Oh, I'm not sure, Mark replied. Communists? I guess, but communists were crazy evil too, weren't they? Yeah, they were. So there's no actual good guys in that scenario? I guess not. But really, you're asking the wrong guy. Honestly, most of that shit is internet shit. I mean, like, I know there are Nazis and commies and they're real, but I don't know. It seems like a whole lot of wasted energy trying to be something like that. It's like being a bad guy in that way just seems like it take up a whole lot of time and energy. You notice political people are almost never happy. They do seem angry all the time. Yeah, Supreme conceded. What a shitty way to live. Yeah, and it sucks too when they try to draw you into their bullshit. As he spoke, Supreme felt as though his mind was reaching new heights and expanding to new places. He suddenly had a political opinion, which he'd never really had before, and it was that political opinions are dumb. It was a good hill to die on, as he'd seen said on Twitter, even if he didn't understand the overall irony to taking such a position on with such zeal and conviction as he had. But he felt righteous about it, and felt it was time to speak to the world. Supreme nodded, mostly to himself. Fuck yeah, he said. I'm gonna email them right now. That's the spirit, a still stoned Mark said, raising his metal hand in the sign of the devil. Supreme sat forward in his lounger, practically on the edge of his seat, as he searched the podcast's website for a contact email. As he did, Mark tapped his feet idly. The silence that had fallen made sense, but still made him uncomfortably awkward. Kinda surprised you get such good service out here, he said, attempting to kill the dead air. Huh? Supreme said, looking up from his phone. Your data service. You get service out here. Mark followed up, realizing how much he hated small talk. Yeah, it's pretty good. I just need to... Oh, yeah, of course, sorry. Supreme returned to typing. After some few minutes of entering his text, he held the phone aloft, shooting a selfie to attach to the message. An easy way, he reasoned, to verify to Hogan or whoever answered the email that he was indeed himself. There. And sent, he said, clicking finally on the send button with an unearned yet gratifying sense of accomplishment. Now it's just a waiting game. What do you want to do in the meantime? Replied Mark, starting to feel a little excited for his new friend. The Bro Hogan Sideshow was one of the biggest podcasts on the internet, and it would be cool to know his buddy got a chance to go on. Oh, we could shoot back to the city and do a team-up thing. Find some bad guys and fuck them up like. Mark wasn't actually opposed to the idea. Despite the exhausting beating he had taken thus far, his suit's internal medical response protocols had been, without his immediate awareness, gradually doping him up since taking the first real hit. It was not intoxicating, but it caused him to feel fighting fit despite numerous serious contusions, at least one broken rib, and with all likelihood an unaddressed concussion that he was generally unaware of. But, feeling fine, he did want to take another go at doing some super stuff in his super suit. The problem, though, was where he could go. If he was to show up in any larger American or even European city, his handlers, those who put him in the machine, might want to take it back. As much as he did wish to escape it, so long as he was wearing it, the odds of ending up back in Rikers, or worse, were greatly diminished. What about one of those wars? Maybe we could go help some freedom fighters or something, he suggested after a short think. Which one? There are loads of them, and to be honest, unless it's our guys fighting on one side, it gets kind of tricky figuring out who's who, Supreme replied, thinking back to that first foreign conflict and how messy the whole thing was. The two both furrowed their brows as they commenced thinking. Mark, as he found himself increasingly longing for all manner of things outside of his suit, and would need to figure a way out eventually. But at least he wanted to kick the tires just a bit more. Then an idea dawned on him that could serve both of these purposes nicely. What about, he began, going and hitting a drug cartel? Like, we fly into their compounds and just start fucking them up. Those guys are about as bad as they come. Supreme considered this moment, and a smile began to creep across his face. Cartel members were indeed the sort of bad guys no one would miss or complain about, and if it was anything like he'd seen in the movies, their bases were usually in remote jungle hideouts, far from any potential collateral damage or civilian bystanders. How will we find them? Supreme asked, considering that even though it may be broad daylight by the time they arrive in whatever country they were headed to, secret bases are usually made, so they were really hard to find. But his sidekick had just the solution. It had been in that moment he had decided that Mark was officially going to be his sidekick, and he'd surprise him with the invitation after they'd kicked some ass. You get me high enough over the jungles, my suit will be able to find them with, like, infrared x-ray shit. Then you fly in and drop me, and I'll do a whole superhero landing, and then you fly over and do your thing, and I'll never know what hit him. Mark was getting genuinely excited, partly for his chance to really play superhero, partly the steroids coursing through his body without either his awareness or consent. Supreme was sold. Rising from their seats, they shared an excited fist bump before heading out of the building. through the open bay door. Once outside, Supreme began by rising into the air and floating around Mark the mechanoid, looking for a suitable place to grab on. Behind the helmet, raised a bit between his shoulders, a thick metal bar provided Supreme with just the handle he was searching for. Picking his friend and sidekick up, as one might a piece of luggage, Supreme soared into the sky above and looked down to Mark, who dangled rather awkwardly from his hand.
Which way?
He asked as Mark attempted to look up at him.
What?
Mark shouted back.
What way? I don't have a compass and it's still dark. I think that's south, right?
He shouted this time, pointing more or less in front of them.
Yeah, south,
Mark replied, pointing with a metal knife hand motion, in more or less the same general direction. And with that, they were off. Supreme took care not to fly too fast, lest he injure Mark further, but they still made it to the southern border, crossing over Louisiana and into the Gulf of Mexico in what felt like no time at all. Soon as the creeping light of early dawn began to illuminate the sky and the reflection of it upon the water gave way to land, a seaside town along the northern coast of Venezuela greeted them as they soared up and over the land even higher. Of course, Supreme had no idea he was over Venezuela in particular, and with his notably limited sense of direction and geography, he assumed he had flown over some portion of Mexico. Mark, on the other hand, found after this first hour that the flight itself was not as terrifying as he initially thought. It was even fun. During this time, he had managed to find a way to activate his heads-up display to show him his ongoing flight trajectory and GPS location. But beyond this, he realized that this was in fact the first time he'd ever left the country, and though he hadn't yet stepped foot on South American soil, he had technically traveled there, farther than he'd ever traveled before. Perhaps heroism had its benefits. Soon they crossed over into Colombia, where Mark was surprised to see his heads-up display lighting up with all manner of longer-distance target recommendations. It would seem in their deploying of the cutting-edge military supersuit, they had either forgotten to remove its targeting and intelligence credentials, or simply assumed Mark would be too stupid to access or understand them, the latter of which would prove to be unfortunately true. However, as they careened through the sky, Mark's metallic legs dangling in open air, a target alert populated on his display, and he quickly signaled for Supreme's attention.
What's up?
Supreme asked, coming to a mid-air hover, hundreds, if not thousands of feet above the surface. As he spoke, he lifted Mark up to eye level to hear him more accurately.
just down there,
Mark shouted, pointing down and off to the right.
My helmet says it's a cartel camp.
Supreme looked to where he was pointing, seeing the small wafts of smoke coming up from the deep jungle within. Looking again to Mark, he nodded and offered him a thumbs up with his free hand, before lowering him again and beginning his descent towards the camp. Mark waved his arms again, causing Supreme to stop once more and again lift him up to eye level.
Okay,
Mark began, shouting even though he really didn't need to.
You come in kind of low above the trees and just drop me right in the middle of their camp, alright? Just right in the middle. Then you come around and laser them from the sky, and after that, we just tear through them as we want, yeah?
Supreme liked the sound of Mark's plan. More specifically, he liked the mental image it put in his head, with the movie of their epic deeds needing only a soundtrack, which Supreme imagined without hesitation. The actual physics to the maneuver were not even just a mystery to Supreme, but something entirely outside the purview of his thoughts. Nevertheless, as he zeroed in on his target, he began to slow down and drop in altitude. He didn't want to break Mark's legs, even if they were shrouded in advanced military armor. For Mark's part, the suit seemed to pick up on the idea of what they were doing, and immediately began flashing warning lights that their speed and altitude were too high to effectively make it drop. This was likewise lost on Supreme, who could neither see nor hear the flailing Mark below him due to his razor-sharp focus on what he had mentally come to call the mission. Mark knew it was going to hurt. Hopefully, it would at least look cool. Supreme felt his pulse began to race as he flew down into what he had hoped would be one problem-free act of superheroism of his career thus far. Mark did as well, as the alarms about his approach vector being less than optimal. Soon they came in for their final approach, and as Mark closed his eyes as tight as he could, hoping to salvage something of his landing, as much as hoping his spinal column might survive, Supreme let him go.
Just what in the hell are they doing down there?
The general grumbled as he watched the GPS coordinates of his army's very expensive battlesuit fly into Colombian airspace.
It looks as though they're going in for an attack on a cartel base, sir.
A nameless drone of an enlisted man said from the control desk off in a corner of a room most at the table had forgotten existed.
Fuck me, really? Where is it?
The bearded CIA agent said, slightly frantic at the prospect.
Sending you the coordinates now, sir.
The control operator said mechanically as the map and coordinates of Supreme's landing came up both on the agent's display as well as on the main screen.
Subtle. Thank you, Private.
Or soon to be Private. Fuck, the agent said, sparing him a venomous glance before looking to his display.
No, never mind. No, that's not one of ours. I'd say let him blow off some steam and take the competition out.
The assembled suits and military brass looked at the bearded agent with looks that said both that they knew what he was talking about, but that perhaps he should say the quiet parts quietly, if at all. The agent unfazed. He merely rolled his eyes. Mark closed his eyes as he rolled as best as he could as Supreme deposited him into the soil of the now very alerted cocaine camp. On his way down, he noticed heat spikes, which told him that this was a processing station. A mix of documentaries and eavesdropping in Rikers led him to feel confident in his assertion. But as he tumbled, his hope for a straight-ahead, earth-shattering landing were dashed, as he instead tumbled for unknown yards at a time until getting his feet underneath him. Once he felt his balance again, Mark impressed himself as he steadied his feet beneath him, sliding backwards at considerable speed, his armored feet carving up the ground before bringing him to a stop. Mark stood up. Above he saw Supreme flying in circles, his hands thrown up in celebration upon seeing what was a very cool entrance. From there, Mark found himself frozen, unsure of what to do next.
Hey!
Supreme shouted from above.
Remember, these are legit bad guys. No regrets, dude.
As the last word left his lips, Supreme paused and looked down to offer a final line of encouragement.
You're my sidekick now, dude. Go nuts.
From there, Supreme wasted no time in drawing the bright red line of death from his eyes up and down the assembling fighters, who had already begun to open fire on both of them. It wasn't until the third or so bullet pinged off Mark's metal shell that he responded, firing a rocket directly into a nearby truck which pulled up with enemies aplenty within. The fireball which followed stopped him dead in his tracks. Never had he seen such destruction, let alone caused it. It was, in a word, awesome. Switching over to his flamethrowers, Mark painted the small structures and screaming narcos in fire, spinning in place and laughing maniacally. He was having the time of his life. Supreme was enjoying himself as well, feeling for once that he was relatively safe from both negative reactions to his heroing, as well as, for the most part, no civilians to get in the way. He had grown a little bored with simply setting the large encampment and cocaine processing facility ablaze with his eyes, and so opted to land. He sped towards an utterly terrified man holding a rifle aloft, trying in vain to fire it, not being old or wise enough to know what the safety catch was or that it was on. After a series of successive clicks, Supreme smiled and reached over, pressing down on the safety catch on the older model Kalashnikov and nodding.
There you go. Now try it.
he said with a wicked smirk on his face. The young narco looked at the weapon and then back at Supreme in terror and confusion. "Come on now," Supreme goaded. Another moment of hesitation, and then, almost in what seemed like an accidental discharge due to nerves, the rifle went off. Supreme slapped his chest where the barrel had been pointing, dropping back as though wounded. His actions, though, far too over the top to be serious or real. The man with the rifle stood shaking as Supreme stood up straight once more, the bullet in his hand and a wicked smile on his face. The rifle dropped to the ground as the young man put his hands up in an act of surrender. Supreme glared at him seriously at first, then smirked and bobbed his head. "Get the fuck out of here," he said, shooing him away with a wave of his hand. The young man stood frozen in terror and confusion, before finally taking a couple cautious steps backwards, and then turning and running for the woodline at a full sprint. Supreme thought of burning a hole through his back as he ran, but then got distracted when he noticed the rifle on the ground, which inspired an idea in him. He had killed men with guns before, but what if? Reaching down, Supreme plucked the Kalashnikov and brought it up to his shoulder. Swinging the barrel around, he bent his knees and began lurching around in an attempt to mimic the sort of tactical movements of Navy SEALs as he'd seen them in the movies. He took aim at a narco emerging from around the side of a burning truck and fired. Several clumps of dirt, feet from the target, leapt into the air as the round smashed harmlessly into the ground. He tried again, taking closer aim and squeezing the trigger hard, hoping it would somehow make him a better shot. Again, though, the man continued moving, unfazed by the rounds which clearly missed him by enough of a margin to only barely be noticed. Supreme found himself growing annoyed. Looking at the side of the weapon, he saw the fire selector, and switching it to fully automatic, let loose as the heavy 7.62 rounds sprayed from the barrel. Several did nothing but pass above his target, with a few more thumping into the ground, before the final few from the magazine managed to hit their target, causing him to fall to the ground. This surprisingly felt strange to Supreme. He had killed many people already, yet never like that. Never in such a normal way. It felt odd. Yet as he picked up a full magazine from one of the dead bodies at his feet and, after some struggle, managed to reload the weapon, he found it kind of fun. A bit like a hyper-realistic game of Call of Duty, where he could get shot multiple times and still manage to carry on. In reality, this was more akin to playing such a game with cheat modes enabled, but that didn't bother Supreme, as he performed pointless shoulder rolls, poorly executed sweep and clear movements, and in general, acted more like a child with a water gun than anything approaching an actual soldier. As he ran about playing special operator, Mark found something wonderful, at least according to him. In the madness and chaos of the attack, the majority of those working in the processing and packing tents had wisely fled. Upon bursting into one of the large tent structures, expecting to find a host of enemies, he instead found a very large and very well-lit mountain of uncut cocaine left behind by the terrified workers. He cursed his helmet for a moment, before coming to what would generally be regarded as a genius-level bad move on his part. Approaching the large white pile of powder, Mark felt again for his helmet's air intakes, and upon finding one, turned his head and helmet slightly before smashing the side of it and its vent clean into the large mound of hard drugs. Alarms sounded, louder than the usual, as instead of a foreign substance being in the air system, its intake was entirely packed, causing a secondary set of pressurized clearance valves to open, blowing hard and fast from the helm. The blast caused the powder before him to scatter everywhere throughout the large tent. The alarms continued, and soon the same computer voice in his helmet spoke again. "Hazardous air contaminant detected. Initiating exterior purge," the voice said. Mark's eyes widened in a momentary horror as several flame jets opened along the frame of his suit, expelling short and massive plumes of fire, igniting and nearly vaporizing the floating cocaine. When the jets had stopped, a momentary whir of fans from the same jets were heard as the residual smoke clouded around. However, as the tent flaps were closed, most of the smoke lingered in the air, much of it making its way into Mark's helmet. He breathed deep, more out of a sudden terror than for effect, which rendered itself regardless. His pupils widened, his heart rate increased. Medical alarms regarding his physiological reaction to a plume of cocaine smoke filling his helmet sounded as his mind momentarily realized the intakes must have been an oversight when programming this response. He was, without a doubt, higher than he'd ever been before. A rush suddenly overcame him, and he began bounding out of the tent space, guns and flamers ablaze as he took once again to the field of battle. This time, with God knows how much inhaled cocaine smoke was coursing through his bloodstream. He was a berserker in that moment, laughing and hooting with glee as his mounted wrist blades tore into and through the enemies he spotted, most of whom were trying to run away. An orgy of blood and carnage, accompanied by Mark's hysterical laughter, made even more haunting by the voice modulation of his helmet ensued. One after another, Mark stabbed, swept, shot, or burned person after person with no regard for if they were armed or fleeing. The bloodthirst, combined with his sense of invulnerability, had him leaping into fray after fray, so savagely that even Supreme will try and rein him in. After giving up on living out a video game behind rifles and machine guns he was shamefully unskilled and competent with, he had taken up 2 rifles by the barrels and was using them as dual-wielded cudgels. Much as with the swords in the mall and the rifles just moments ago, his actions with them were clumsy, inelegant, and most of all, useless. His arms would bunch up in attempts to swing the backwards weapons like war axes, with him shattering one of the wooden buttstocks as it slammed into his forehead under the needless and poorly aimed momentum he had gifted it with. It didn't faze him, though the momentary sense of embarrassment that washed over him after realizing how that must have looked did give him a moment's pause. Throwing down the weapon, he noticed that, in general, the area was largely cleared, at least of the living. They, however many there were, had legged it into the jungle in 1,000 different terrified directions, most simply hoping the villages they were plucked from with promise of work and money were still intact. Supreme surveyed the field. The only remaining action seemed to be coming from out in the field, out of view behind the large weapons tent. Screams of agony, terror, and the hoarse begging voices of those about to be snuffed out all filled the air. It was then that Supreme realized Mark had moved on from the main camp. Quickly observing a trail of body parts, blood, and viscera decorating the dusty dirt path that weaved its way through the small, hidden tent city, he noted that his sidekick seemed to be building a bigger, if not simply more aggressive body count than himself. He rose from the ground silently, rising just high enough to see out into the aforementioned field. It was more of a clearing on the edge of camp, really, stretching no more than 100 yards out before the jungle tree line took over. In the middle of the clearing, Mark could be seen, or, no, rather, the mechanoid. Mark the mechanoid could be seen, tearing a screaming, previously armed man quite literally in half. He let out a hearty yet unsettling howl of violent ecstasy as the spray of blood and entrails coated his armor. Supreme, for all his violent acts and periodic bloodlust, felt a little bit like vomiting as he watched. It was excessive, even for him. But such was made worse when, while using what he assumed were servo-assisted limbs, Mark the mechanoid made a mad dash for the last of the fleeing survivors, following them into the jungle. Supreme thought he should intervene, that he should swoop in and reel his sidekick in, but for some reason, at least for a matter of moments of indeterminable length, he didn't. Flames erupted and billows of smoke plumed upward and out of the jungle canopy. The sounds of automatic gunfire and numerous loud bangs and kabooms could be heard from within the dense and seemingly impenetrable jungle. Further screams of terror and pain, many of which Supreme could specifically hear end in a gurgle of blood, or at least what he hoped was blood, cried out. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The silence was itself overpowering, deafening even to one such as Supreme, who in that stillness found an eerie sense of unease. It seemed to stretch out forever, until a successive crunching of soil and underbrush could be heard. Moments later, Mark the Mechanoid emerged. His hunter-green armor was painted in wet, deep crimson, which dripped from the sharper corners of its build. The shoulders and chest of the machine suit heaved as Mark, still high as a kite, and now coming down off of a notable workout, stood bloodied and mad in the tall grass just beyond the trees. You get him? Supreme asked in a shout which sounded wary.
You fucking better believe I got him,
Mark cheered in response.
Holy shit. Holy shit. I didn't know it was this amazing. This superhero stuff.
Well, yeah. You went a little hard here.
I did. Yes, I did. They had it coming. We agreed on that, right? Didn't we?
Supreme nodded his agreement. The more to stave off any existential crisis or desire for more Mark might be on the edge of. Yeah, they had it coming. The two looked at one another from their respective vantage points as the camp around them burned and smoldered. Here and there, groans from the wounded and dying would arise. Mark turned his head, looking at Supreme, unsure if he should quicken them. Mark knew not of the term quickening the dead, but felt an urge to end them and their suffering all the same. Supreme simply squinted and raised an eyebrow. You okay, Mark? He asked.
Shit, yeah. Never been better. Why?
Mark said, his short words flying at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Just, you seem really into it. A little too into it is all. You sure you're good? Mark breathed heavily and rapidly.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm great. 5 by fucking 5. Should we do another one?
Supreme would have normally gone for it, but something in Mark's demeanor worried him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was strange. At that moment, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was exactly the get-out-of-conversation free card he didn't know he was wishing for. No! Shit! Hold on, he said as he pulled the phone from his pocket. He paused a moment and marveled at how, despite his outfit being torn up by gunfire, as was often the case, his phone had survived, with only a single grazing shot making contact with his pants some inch to the left of where it was. Whichever pocket it may have been in whichever direction an inch to the left might have meant, is left to wild speculation and fan theory. Punching his code in, Supreme saw a new email had arrived in his inbox. It was from the Bro Hogan Sideshow. Even in the sample text below the title, he could see they were excited he'd reached out. He looked to Mark and held up his phone. Brogan got back to me, he shouted. This managed to knock Mark's very fragile attention span completely off the joys of murder as he turned his head to the side and, within his helmet, smiled.
No shit. What'd they say?
He asked giddily. Hold on, Supreme replied, tapping on the email. After a quick moment reading, his face lit up like a birthday cake. They want to know when I can go on the show.
Well, shit. What are you going to tell them?
Mark shouted. I could do tomorrow. Should I tell them that?
Yeah. No, why not? Besides, you'll need a new outfit. That one's a little shot up, you know?
Mark said, gesturing wildly upwards towards Supreme. Supreme took a look down, seeing that once again his outfit had been shot to hell, and he would need another. Fortunately, upon his last commandeering spree, he had the foresight to take multiple stacks of his costume so as to have replacements when such became inevitably necessary. He nodded. "Let's head back," he said. Mark protested.
Really? Like, can't we just go ahead another one of these and then head back?
Supreme couldn't put his finger on it specifically, but it almost seemed like for some reason, taking Mark to another narco camp might not be a good idea. He eyed him a moment before shaking his head. "No, maybe later in the week. We did good damage here. I'm satisfied. Let's head back. I'll tell them I can go on tomorrow if they're willing, and I'd like to kick it a bit and get a shower in." Mark felt cheated, but relented, realizing his insane high was already starting to diminish. "Okay, just one thing first. Just 1 minute," he shouted up to Supreme. Supreme raised his eyebrow again, but merely shrugged. Mark shot him a very quick thumbs up before scrambling full speed back to the camp and into one of the still-standing tents. A burst of flame and smoke erupted from within, and it smelled simply terrible. It was like melted plastic mixed with burning Tylenol, combined in the perfect way to make any individual who smelled it think it was made specifically to offend their senses alone. Moments later, Mark emerged from the tent. His armor, which was still caked with blood, now blackened as though it had been through a barbecue smoker. He let out a whoop as he did. "Woo!" he shouted. All right. Let's fly, baby. Mach 10, Mach fucking 20, boy," he shouted, raising his arms in victory. Supreme wasn't sure what to make of this, but picking him up by the shoulder strut he had on their way down, he took the two of them off at speed into the sky. For the first half of the flight, Mark was a wriggling mess of excitement, constantly insisting they go faster. Even with the wind speed, Supreme could still hear him chattering and blathering away in excitement.
Did you notice how they all seem to be wearing masks? Wasn't that awesome? Like, it made it so much easier to just plow through them like the spawn of a fucking tank to fuck the freight train, you know? Man, that was something. I get it now why they always put masks on the bad guy henchmen in movies. It's so like they are like people. Like, I haven't even thought about who any of those guys even were. Like, they might have had families and shit. And
his rambling began trailing off for a bit, but not before returning as one thought was quickly replaced entirely with another.
But, yeah, it was like a fucking video game, man. I was like, all hacking and slashing, and then the flamethrowers, and just lit the place up, and fuck, this shit's amazing, man.
Supreme took to zoning out to the white noises of their travels. At some point, Mark grew quiet, then, as it seemed, went limp, hanging like a rag doll. Supreme didn't ask any questions, and instead focused on following the coastline until he could recognize Boston Harbor, and from there, another speedy flight northwest to the abandoned warehouse of solitude. He had things to do, important things. First of which was a shower and a change of clothes. Bullet holes aside, by the time Mark had stopped fidgeting, a good deal of narco viscera had flash frozen to his body. It was rather uncomfortable, and were it not for the airspeed, would likely have smelled terrible. At the undisclosed power table, deep below the earth, beneath an undisclosed mountain, the room was choked with nervous cigarette, but mostly cigar smoke. The cabal sat silent, some on the edge of their seats, worried of an impending strike of some kind, but most simply lounging and enjoying the show. Supreme had proven to be more of a loose cannon than they had hoped, and as for their stooge Mark, though he'd failed to bring Supreme in the way they'd hoped, offering him a position on a super team that would serve as a smokescreen to ensure their control over him, those with minds for plans and plots saw within him still great potential. "They've left Colombian airspace and are moving rapidly back northward, sir," the nameless enlisted lackey at the computer station reported. "Our agent is experiencing heart arrhythmias. His vitals are concerning." "Could probably just blow some yayo while butchering narcos. Nothing out of the ordinary," CIA said nonchalantly, as though everyone had such an experience. The general turned to speak over his shoulder.
What's your little punk's name?
Not sure. Mike, or something like that. Gordon, the voice in the shadows, replied with a chuckle.
What's your blackest black side?
The general asked of CIA. You mean Peachtree? CIA replied. The general scowled and bit down on his cigar.
No, the real blackest.
CIA paused, but then quickly dropped the front and shrugged.
Sure, Blackbriar. When this is all over, I want that dopehead piece of shit in there tongue-punching ISIS asshole for shit paper for the rest of his life.
The general growled. CIA merely shrugged again.
Well, that all depends, I guess. Depends on what? On how long the kid can live off his own recycled piss and shit. He might get a little high here and there, but that is otherwise a closed system. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Engineer, he added, snidely, as the unnamed corporate overlord in the beautiful black suit. The man merely smirked and nodded. At his present rate, his body will begin to shut down within roughly 2 weeks' time. We designed these suits for long-range expeditions, but they weren't made to be worn indefinitely. Well, hey, tell me honestly, did you fix the piss tube? CIA asked with a bit of a crass smile. I'm sorry, Mr. whatever your name is. That is proprietary information, and I'm not allowed to disclose it. You understand? As he spoke, he returned CIA's grin exactly, giving him the chuckle he desired, without having to say a word. Sir, we've intercepted one of the target's emails. It appears he'll be appearing on a podcast tomorrow. The nameless soldier at the screen announced. Podcasts? Grumbled the general. Yes, sir. The Bro Hogan Sideshow. Oh, I love that one, Frank, the naval admiral, chirped with excitement. No one cares, Frank. So how do we make this work to our advantage? The general barked in reply. I might have an idea, said CIA calmly. But you might not like it.
Chilling tales for dark nights.